The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the clouds as rain drizzled over downtown Seattle. The usual buzz of the city was starting to build, cars honking in the distance, the smell of fresh coffee wafting from corner cafes, and people rushing past with their umbrellas and briefcases, all trying to make it to work on time. Among the crowd walked Priya, a young woman in her early 30s, clutching a takeaway coffee cup in one hand and her phone in the other. Every morning for the past 2 years, she'd walked this same route to the marketing agency where she worked. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every store window, and even the familiar faces of other regular morning commuters, the old man who always fed pigeons by the park, the teenage barista who gave her a friendly wave through the coffee shop window, and the construction workers who gathered at the corner deli. But this morning felt different. Maybe it was the way the rain was falling, softer than usual, or maybe it was because she'd actually gotten enough sleep the night before. Whatever it was, Priya found herself noticing things she usually missed in her rush to work. That's when she saw her, an elderly woman sitting in the doorway of an old bookstore that had closed down months ago. The woman wasn't like the other homeless people Priya occasionally saw on her route. There was something about her that made Priya stop in her tracks. She sat with perfect posture, despite her circumstances, her silver hair neatly combed and pinned back. Her clothes, though worn, were clean and carefully mended. In her lap lay a small cardboard sign, the words written in elegant handwriting, "Lost everything. Any help appreciated. God bless." What caught Priya's attention most was the book in the woman's hands. A weathered copy of Pride and Prejudice. The pages were dog-eared and the spine was cracked, signs of a book that had been read and loved many times. The woman wasn't asking for money or making a scene. She was just sitting there, completely absorbed in her reading, as if she were in a cozy library rather than a cold doorway. Other pedestrians walked past, some quickening their pace, others pretending not to notice. A businessman nearly tripped over the woman's extended feet, muttering under his breath as he hurried along. But the woman didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she was just used to being invisible. Priya found herself slowing down, then stopping completely. She checked her watch. She was actually early for once, thanks to skipping her usual morning social media scroll. The woman must have sensed someone watching her because she looked up from her book and their eyes met. Those eyes, they weren't filled with desperation or plea for help. Instead, they held a quiet dignity and intelligence that seemed to look right through Priya. They were the eyes of someone who had seen better days and knew they would again, even if the path there wasn't clear yet. The woman smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her whole face, making her look younger somehow. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and warm, carrying a hint of what sounded like a British accent. "Lovely weather for Austin, wouldn't you say?" It wasn't what Priya expected to hear from someone sitting on the street. There was no request for money, no sad story, just a simple literary reference delivered with a touch of humor. That unexpected moment, that simple human connection, would end up changing both their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The rain continued to fall softly around them, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 9 times. But Priya didn't move. For the first time in years, being on time for work didn't seem like the most important thing in the world. Sometimes, she would later reflect, the most meaningful moments in life come when we least expect them, on ordinary rainy mornings when we finally slow down enough to really see the people around us. That simple comment about Jane Austen broke the ice. Priya found herself smiling back, suddenly aware that she was still holding her cooling coffee. Without thinking twice, she asked, "Would you like a fresh cup? The cafe around the corner makes a great breakfast blend." The elderly woman looked surprised, as if she wasn't used to such offers anymore. She carefully marked her place in the book with a neatly folded receipt before responding, "That's very kind of you, dear. I'm Grace, by the way." Her British accent became more noticeable as she spoke. As Grace carefully stood up, Priya noticed how she moved with a certain elegance despite her circumstances. She gathered her few belongings, the book, a worn leather bag, and a small blanket, with the kind of care someone might show to precious possessions. The cafe was warm and inviting, the morning rush having died down. The teenage barista, who usually just gave Priya a quick wave, raised an eyebrow at her second visit of the morning but said nothing. They found a quiet corner table, and soon 2 steaming cups of coffee sat between them. "You know," Grace said, warming her hands around the cup, "it's funny how life turns out. 20 years ago, I was the one buying coffee for struggling students at the university where I taught." She took a careful sip, closing her eyes briefly to savor the warmth. Pryor leaned forward, intrigued. "You were a professor?" "Literature and business ethics, if you can believe it. Quite the combination, isn't it?" Grace's eyes sparkled with memories. "I started in the business world, actually. Built up a decent consulting firm in London, but my heart was always with books. When my husband got an opportunity in Seattle, I saw it as a chance to chase my real passion." She paused, running a finger along the rim of her cup. "We had a wonderful life here. A lovely house overlooking the water, summer garden parties where my students would come to discuss poetry." Her voice trailed off, and Pryor noticed a shadow cross her face. "What happened?" Pryor asked softly, then quickly added, "If you don't mind sharing." Grace straightened her shoulders slightly. "Life happened, dear. My husband, got sick. Cancer. The American healthcare system." She shook her head. "We had insurance, of course, but they were experimental treatments not covered, and then complications. We'd burned through our savings, sold the house, everything." The morning light streaming through the cafe window caught the silver in Grace's hair as she continued. "After Robert passed, I tried to keep teaching, but the grief, it does strange things to you. I missed classes, couldn't grade papers. The university was understanding, but eventually I had to step down. The medical bills kept coming, and well," she gestured to her worn clothes with a small, dignified shrug. "What about family?" Pryor asked, thinking of her own parents and how they'd always said family was life's safety net. A look of pain crossed Grace's face. "My daughter, Anna, she's in Boston. We had a falling out years ago over my decision to leave the business world. She thought I was being irresponsible, throwing away everything I'd built. We haven't spoken in years." "Pride," she smiled sadly. "It's not just a theme in Austen's novels." The breakfast crowd had thinned out completely now, leaving them in a peaceful bubble of conversation. Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. "The funny thing is," Grace continued, pulling out her copy of Pride and Prejudice, "this book was a gift from Anna. She gave it to me when she graduated high school, said it reminded her of all the times I'd read it to her as a child." She opened the cover carefully, revealing a handwritten message inside that Pryor couldn't quite read. "I keep thinking I should sell it. It's a nice edition, might fetch a decent price. But some things—" She closed the book gently. "Some things are worth more than money." Pryor checked her phone and was shocked to see how much time had passed. She was definitely late for work now, but somehow it didn't seem to matter as much as it would have an hour ago. "I should get going," she said reluctantly, "but Grace, would you be willing to meet me here again tomorrow? Same time?" The older woman's eyes widened slightly. "You don't have to do that, dear." "I'm sure you have better things to do than listen to an old woman's stories." Pryor smiled, already reaching for her phone to send a quick message to her office. "Actually, I can't think of many things better than discussing literature over coffee. Besides," she added with a gentle smile, "I'd love to hear more about your teaching days." "I'd always wanted to study literature, but ended up in marketing instead." As they stood up to leave, Grace carefully tucked her book back into her bag. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you remind me a bit of Elizabeth Bennet, more interested in the story beneath the surface than what everyone else sees." Watching Grace gather her few possessions, Pryor had already begun forming a plan in her mind. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she knew she had to help this remarkable woman find her way back. Sometimes, she thought, the most extraordinary stories start with something as simple as a cup of coffee and a conversation about books. That night, Pryor couldn't sleep. The steady patter of rain against her apartment window kept her company as she sat cross-legged on her couch, laptop balanced on her knees. Her half-eaten dinner sat forgotten on the coffee table as she dove deep into research about homeless services in Seattle. The more she read, the more her heart sank. The waiting lists for affordable housing were months long. Emergency shelters were often full, especially during the rainy season. But there had to be something she could do. She couldn't bear the thought of Grace spending another night in that doorway, especially with the weather getting colder. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her boss about the meeting she'd missed that morning. "Hope everything's okay," it read. "Let me know if you need anything." Priya smiled, grateful to work for someone understanding. That's when an idea started forming in her mind. The next morning, she arrived at the cafe extra early, armed with printouts and a notebook. Grace was already there, standing under the awning of the closed bookstore, carefully folding her blanket. "I brought breakfast," Priya called out, holding up a paper bag of still warm pastries. The smile that lit up Grace's face made her heart squeeze. Over steaming coffee and flaky croissants, Priya laid out her research. "There's a women's shelter just 10 blocks from here," she explained, spreading out a map. "They have a program specifically for seniors. It's not just a bed. They help with job placement, medical care, everything." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "That's very kind, dear, but I've tried shelters before. They can be quite rough." "This one's different," Priya insisted gently. "I spoke with them last night. They have private rooms, not just beds in a hall." And she hesitated before continuing. "I told them about your background in teaching. They're actually looking for someone to help with their GED program." Grace's eyes widened. "Teaching again?" For a moment, Priya saw a flash of the professor she must have been, confident, purposeful. "Just a few hours a week to start," Priya explained. "But it would give you a small income, plus priority for their housing program." She watched as hope and fear battled across Grace's face. "I don't know," Grace whispered, clutching her copy of Pride and Prejudice like a shield. "It's been so long since I've taught. And my clothes." She gestured helplessly at her worn outfit. "That's the other thing," Priya smiled, reaching for her tote bag. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought something." She pulled out a neatly folded blouse and skirt she'd chosen carefully from her own closet. "For the interview, if you want it." Grace touched the fabric gently, as if afraid it might disappear. "Interview. This afternoon. Only if you're ready," Priya added quickly. "The shelter's program coordinator, Mrs. Chen, she's willing to meet with you today. No pressure, just a conversation." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked softly. "You don't even know me." Priya thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. "You know that feeling when you're reading a really good book and you just know there's so much more to the story? That's how I felt when I saw you yesterday. Everyone else was rushing past, but I just knew there was more to your story." "More like a cautionary tale," Grace said with a hint of her old humor, but Priya shook her head. "More like a story that's not finished yet," she corrected gently. "Listen, I know it's scary. Starting over always is. But you taught business ethics, right? What would you tell a student who was afraid to take a chance?" Grace laughed softly, dabbing at her eyes with a paper napkin. "I'd probably quote Austen. I cannot fix on the hour, or the spot, or the look or the words, which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew that I had begun." "Exactly," Priya smiled, even though she didn't recognize the quote. "Sometimes we don't realize we're starting a new chapter until we're already in the middle of it." The morning sun had fully risen now, turning the wet streets into mirrors of light. Through the cafe window, they could see the city coming to life. People hurrying to work, delivery trucks making their rounds, a street cleaner washing away yesterday's rain. "You'll come with me?" Grace asked finally, her fingers still resting on the folded blouse. "To meet Mrs. Chen, of course," Priya replied, already pulling out her phone to email work. "I took the whole day off. We'll get you ready, maybe find a place where you can freshen up first." She stopped, realizing she might be overwhelming Grace with plans. But Grace was sitting straighter now, a familiar dignity returning to her posture. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I used to tell my students that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help when it's offered." She carefully placed her book in her worn bag and picked up the fresh clothes. "I suppose it's time I took my own advice." As they left the cafe together, the teenage barista gave them a thumbs up through the window. Somehow, Priya knew this was just the beginning. Like any good story, there would be challenges ahead, setbacks and struggles. But for now, watching Grace clutch her new clothes with determined hope, she felt certain that this chapter would have a happy ending. The interview with Mrs. Chen went better than anyone could have expected. As Priya sat in the shelter's small office, watching Grace discuss teaching methods and curriculum development, she couldn't help but smile. With every passing minute, the homeless woman from the doorway disappeared, replaced by the confident professor she'd once been. "Your experience is exactly what we need," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Many of our residents struggled in traditional educational settings. They need someone who understands both academic and real-world challenges." Grace nodded thoughtfully, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The borrowed clothes fit well enough, and after freshening up in the shelter's facilities, she looked transformed. "I've always believed that education is about more than just books," she explained. "It's about helping people find their own strength." That evening, Priya helped Grace settle into her temporary room at the shelter. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window overlooking a small courtyard. "It's not much," Mrs. Chen had apologized, but Grace's eyes had filled with tears of gratitude. "It's a palace compared to that doorway," she whispered, carefully placing her copy of Pride and Prejudice on the desk, her first personal touch in her new space. Back at her apartment that night, Priya couldn't stop thinking about ways to help further. Her job in social media marketing had taught her the power of storytelling, of reaching people's hearts through authentic narratives. An idea began to take shape. She opened her laptop and started typing, "Meet Grace, former professor, current fighter." The words flowed easily as she described the remarkable woman she'd met, her journey from success to struggle, and her unwavering dignity through it all. She was careful to respect Grace's privacy, focusing on her strength and potential rather than her hardships. Around midnight, her phone buzzed with a message from her boss. "Saw your social media post about Grace. The whole office is talking about it. What can we do to help?" Priya sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. She hadn't expected such a quick response. More messages started coming in, colleagues, friends, even some clients. Everyone wanted to know how they could support Grace's journey back to stability. The next morning, she rushed to the shelter, nearly spilling her coffee in excitement. She found Grace in the common room, already surrounded by a small group of residents, as she explained the basics of resume writing. "You've started teaching already?" Priya asked, amazed. Grace smiled, looking more alive than ever. "Well, someone mentioned they needed help with job applications, and one thing led to another." She gestured to the group, who were diligently taking notes. "It feels good to be useful again." Priya pulled out her phone, showing Grace how her story had resonated with people overnight. "Look at all these comments. People want to help Grace. They're asking about donations, job opportunities even." She paused as she noticed Grace had gone very still, staring at one particular comment. "What is it?" "That name," Grace whispered, her finger hovering over the screen. "Anna Reynolds, that's my daughter." Priya's heart skipped a beat as she read the comment. "Mom, is that you? I've been looking everywhere. Please let me know you're okay." The room seemed to freeze as Grace sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "She's been looking for me? All this time?" Priya sat down beside her, gently taking her hand. "Do you want to respond?" Grace took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders in that familiar way of hers. "I'm not the same person she last saw," she said quietly. "I've lost everything." "No," Priya corrected firmly. "You haven't lost everything. You've lost things, important things, yes, but look at what you still have." She gestured to the residents still working on their resumes. "You have your knowledge, your ability to teach, your dignity. And now you have a chance to rebuild, including your relationship with your daughter." From across the room, Mrs. Chen appeared with a cup of tea, setting it gently in front of Grace. "Family is like a book," she said wisely. "Sometimes we lose our place, but we can always start reading again." Grace smiled at the literary reference, taking a sip of tea to steady herself. "Would you help me write to her?" she asked Priya. "I'm not sure I trust myself to find the right words." "Of course," Priya replied, already pulling up the messaging system. "But I have a feeling that with Anna, like with your students, you'll know exactly what to say when the moment comes." As they sat there, crafting a message to bridge years of silence, Priya couldn't help but marvel at how life worked. Sometimes it took losing everything to find what was truly important. And sometimes it took a random meeting in the rain to start a chain of events that could change multiple lives forever. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of nervous energy. After exchanging messages with Anna, Grace learned that her daughter was already on a flight to Seattle. The shelter's common room had become a flurry of activity as residents helped Grace prepare for the reunion, everyone invested in this story of hope unfolding before them. "What if she's disappointed in me?" Grace whispered to Priya as they waited in the shelter's reception area. She kept smoothing down her borrowed blouse, a nervous gesture that revealed her anxiety. "What if she takes one look at where I am now and then she'll see her mother teaching again, helping others and rebuilding her life?" Priya interrupted gently. "That's nothing to be ashamed of." Mrs. Chen had arranged for the reunion to happen in her office, offering privacy away from curious eyes. The small room looked different today, brightened by a vase of fresh flowers that one of the residents had brought in from her part-time job at a flower shop. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Grace held her copy of Pride and Prejudice close to her chest like a shield. She'd shown Priya the inscription earlier, "To Mom, who taught me that every story deserves a happy ending. Love, Anna." The pages were worn with years of reading, but those words remained clear and strong. When the door finally opened, time seemed to stop. Anna stood there, looking so much like a younger version of Grace that Priya's breath caught in her throat. She was dressed in business attire, clearly having come straight from the airport, her eyes red from either tears or lack of sleep, probably both. "Mom?" Her voice cracked on that single word. Grace stood slowly, still clutching her book. "Anna, But before she could finish, Anna had crossed the room in 3 quick steps and pulled her mother into a tight embrace. The book fell forgotten to the floor as Grace's arms went around her daughter and both women began to cry. "I've been looking everywhere for you," Anna sobbed into her mother's shoulder. "When you stopped answering your phone, I tried calling the university, your friends, everyone. Nobody knew where you'd gone. I hired private investigators, but they couldn't." "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, holding her daughter tighter. "I was ashamed. After your father died, when everything fell apart, I couldn't bear for you to see me like this, to know I'd failed so completely." Anna pulled back just enough to look at her mother's face, wiping tears away with trembling hands. "Failed? Mom, you're the strongest person I know. You followed your dreams. You taught me to follow mine. When I started my tech company, everything you taught me about business ethics became the foundation of our corporate culture." "Your tech company?" Grace asked, surprised. Anna nodded, managing a watery smile. "We're doing pretty well. Actually." She glanced at Priya and Mrs. Chen, who were trying to make themselves invisible in the corner. "That's one of the reasons I've been trying so hard to find you. We're launching a foundation focused on education and housing security. I needed your help with it." "My help?" Grace's voice was barely a whisper. Who better to help shape a program like that than someone who's experienced both sides of the story? Hannah took her mother's hands in hers. "Mom, you always taught me that our hardest challenges can become our greatest wisdom. Everything you're going through, everything you've learned, it could help so many others." Mrs. Chen quietly placed a box of tissues within reach as both women sank into the office's chairs, still holding hands. Priya noticed that Grace's posture had changed. The nervous tension was gone, replaced by something that looked like cautious hope. "I have so much to tell you," Grace said, reaching down to pick up her fallen book. "So much to apologize for." "Me too," Anna interrupted. "I was so angry when you left the business world, when you and Dad moved across the country. I thought you were running away from success. I didn't understand that you were running toward happiness instead." "Not very successfully, as it turns out," Grace said with a hint of her old dry humor. "I don't know about that," Anna smiled, gesturing around the shelter. "You're still teaching, still helping others. And now," she took a deep breath, "now maybe we can work together. If you want to." Priya watched as Grace's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different from before. These were tears of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing. "I'd like that," Grace said softly. "But first, would you tell me about your life? These past few years? I've missed so much." Anna pulled her chair closer, and as she began to share stories about her company, her life in Boston, her recent engagement, Priya quietly slipped out of the office with Mrs. Chen. Through the closing door, they could hear soft laughter mixing with tears, the sound of a broken story beginning to mend itself. In the hallway, one of the residents was waiting anxiously. "How did it go?" Priya smiled, thinking of all the twists and turns that had led to this moment. "It went exactly as it should have," she said. "Sometimes the best chapters come after what we think is the end." The weeks that followed brought changes no one could have predicted. Anna had insisted on staying in Seattle, working remotely while helping her mother settle into a new life. She'd rented a small but comfortable apartment near the shelter, where Grace could have her own space while still staying connected to the community she'd grown to care about. "You don't have to keep teaching here," Anna had said one morning over breakfast, watching her mother prepare lesson plans for the shelter's GED program. "We could find you a position at a proper school or—" Grace looked up from her notes, her eyes clear and determined. "This is where I'm needed," she said simply. "These students, they remind me of myself. They're not just learning subjects. They're learning to believe in themselves again." The shelter's classroom had become a place of transformation. Word had spread about the former professor who taught with such understanding, and soon people from other shelters were asking to join her classes. Mrs. Chen had to find a bigger room to accommodate everyone. One rainy afternoon, Priya stopped by during her lunch break to find Grace leading a lively discussion about business plans. The students, a mix of ages and backgrounds, were completely engaged as Grace drew from both her academic knowledge and recent personal experience. "Remember," Grace was saying, "sometimes life forces us to start over. But starting over doesn't mean starting from nothing. Your experiences, even the difficult ones, are valuable. They're part of what makes your story unique." After class, one of the students stayed behind to share exciting news. She'd landed a job interview at a local cafe. Grace helped her practice her interview skills, drawing from decades of business experience. The woman's eyes shone with newfound confidence as she left. "You know," Priya said, watching the student leave, "you're doing exactly what you did at the university. You're changing lives through education. The only difference is the classroom." Grace smiled, gathering her teaching materials. "The funny thing is, I think I'm a better teacher now. Before, I taught from books. Now, I teach from life." That evening, Anna invited Priya to join them for dinner at the apartment. Over home-cooked pasta, Grace had insisted on cooking, saying she'd missed having a kitchen. Anna shared her plans for the foundation. "We're calling it New Chapters," she explained, spreading out documents on the dining table. "The idea is to combine education with practical support. Mom's experience shows how important both are." Grace added another serving of pasta to Priya's plate before sitting down. "Anna's tech company is providing seed funding, but we want to make it sustainable. Create partnerships with local businesses, universities. And," Anna continued, glancing at her mother with a smile, "we want you on the board, Priya. Your social media expertise, your understanding of how to tell stories that move people to action, we need that." Priya nearly choked on her pasta. "Me, but I just stopped to help a stranger." Grace reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest changes. Later that night, as they shared tea in the small living room, Grace pulled out her treasured copy of Pride and Prejudice. "I've been thinking about what makes a story worth telling," she said thoughtfully. "It's not just the happy endings. It's the journey, the moments when people choose kindness over indifference." Anna, who had been typing on her laptop, looked up. "That reminds me. The Foundation's website needs a story section. Real experiences, real transformations. Would you be willing to share yours, Mom?" Grace was quiet for a moment, running her fingers over the book's worn cover. "A few months ago, I would have said no. I was too ashamed. But now," she looked around the cozy room, at her daughter working late into the night, at Priya who had become like family. "Now I understand that sometimes our hardest chapters can help others write their own stories of hope." Speaking of hope, Anna said, turning her laptop around, "Look at these applications. 3 more shelters want to start education programs. They're asking if you'll help train their teachers." Grace's eyes lit up with the spark of a new challenge. "You know what this means?" she asked. a hint of mischief in her voice. "I'll need to update my teaching materials. Priya dear, would you mind picking up some more notebooks tomorrow? And perhaps," she smiled, "another copy of Pride and Prejudice. I think our future teachers should understand the power of a good story." As Priya headed home that night, she thought about how life could change so completely in just a few weeks. The woman she'd met in a doorway was now helping to build something that would change countless lives. And it all started with a simple conversation about books in the rain. Sometimes, she realized, the best stories are the ones that remind us how connected we all are, that anyone could be one kind act away from having their whole world change for the better. 6 months had passed since that rainy morning when two strangers connected over a book. The seasons had changed, summer had come and gone, and now autumn painted the Seattle streets with golden leaves. The old bookstore where Grace once sought shelter had reopened as the first New Chapters Community Center. On this particular morning, Priya wasn't hurrying past with her coffee. Instead, she stood beside Grace and Anna, watching as people gathered for the grand opening. The storefront had been transformed, its windows bright with displays of books and inspiring quotes. Above the door hung a simple sign, "New Chapters, where every story matters." "I can't believe this is the same place," Grace whispered, her eyes bright with tears. She was dressed elegantly now, her silver hair styled professionally, but she carried the same worn copy of Pride and Prejudice in her hands. "6 months ago, I was sitting in that doorway, wondering if my story was over." Her sleek black car pulled up to the curb, a Rolls-Royce that made heads turn. The driver stepped out to open the back door, and Mrs. Chen emerged, looking pleased but slightly overwhelmed by the luxury. Anna had insisted on sending the car to pick her up for the occasion. "This is too much," Mrs. Chen protested, but Anna shook her head. "Nothing's too much for the person who gave my mother a chance," she said, hugging the shelter director. "Without you, none of this would exist." People were gathering now. Shelter residents past and present, local business owners who'd partnered with the foundation, teachers from the new education program, and even a few curious passers-by. The crowd was a living testament to how one act of kindness could ripple outward, touching countless lives. Grace stepped forward to cut the ribbon, her hands steady as she held the scissors. "Before we go in," she said, turning to address the crowd, "I want to tell you a story. 6 months ago, I thought I had lost everything. My home, my dignity, my family." She reached for Anna's hand. "I was wrong. What I really lost was my way. But then someone stopped to talk to me about books." She smiled at Priya, who felt tears welling up in her eyes. "That simple conversation reminded me that every one of us has value, has something to teach, has a story worth telling. This center isn't just about books or education or even housing, though we'll provide all of those things. It's about recognizing the worth in every person who walks through these doors." The ribbon fell away, and people began to file inside. The space had been thoughtfully designed, with comfortable reading nooks, study areas, and a cafe corner that would provide job training for shelter residents. Upstairs, classrooms and meeting spaces waited for students and support groups. One of Grace's former students from the shelter, now employed as the center's assistant manager, was already showing visitors around. "The books are just the beginning," she explained proudly. "We have computer labs for job searches, financial literacy workshops, and writing classes where people can tell their own stories." Near the entrance, a wall displayed photographs and stories of transformation, people who had found their way back from hardship, each tale a beacon of hope for others. Grace's story was among them, though she'd been humble about including it. "You know what amazes me?" Priya said, watching the space fill with life and energy. "That first morning, when I stopped to talk to you, I was running late for a meeting about social media engagement. I was so worried about missing it, but now I can't even remember what it was about." Grace laughed softly. "Life has a funny way of showing us what really matters. Speaking of which," she reached into her bag and pulled out a brand new copy of Pride and Prejudice. "This is for you. Open it." Priya opened the book to find an inscription, "To the young woman who reminded me that every story has more chapters. Thank you for helping me write mine. Love, Grace." The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the gold lettering on the book spines and making them shine. Outside, the city rushed by as it always had, but inside this space, something magical was happening. People who had felt invisible were being seen. Stories that had seemed finished were finding new beginnings. A young woman entered hesitantly, clutching a worn backpack. Grace noticed her immediately and walked over to greet her, the same way Pryor had once greeted Grace. As they talked quietly by the door, Pryor watched the newcomer's shoulders gradually relax, saw the first hint of a smile touch her face. "Mom's in her element," Anna said, coming to stand beside Pryor. "You know, when I was building my tech company, I thought I was the successful one. Now I realize she's teaching me all over again about what success really means." As if on cue, Grace led the young woman to the cafe corner, where hot coffee and fresh pastries waited. Just like that first morning, a simple conversation over coffee was becoming the first line of a new story. Outside, another autumn rain began to fall, but inside new chapters, warmth and hope filled every corner. The bookstore that had once been just a doorway of refuge had become a gateway to new possibilities, proving that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that begin again.